Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 4 through 9 in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. Last time we saw the sin in the garden, and Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. They were removed from the garden. Now, as we come to chapter 4, we still have that promise back in chapter 3, verse 15, ringing in our ears of continuing conflict between and enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. But as we come to chapter 4, the serpent's no longer mentioned. Instead, we see the woman giving birth through Adam. They come together, Adam and his wife Eve, and they have two children. They have Cain, he's the older one, and then they have Abel. And the question comes up now, how is the Cain and Abel narrative related to the larger story of the book of Genesis? Remember that we had that conflict going on. And the conflict continues now as we come to this section where Cain and Abel, they grow up, they are both going to bring a sacrifice to the Lord, and Cain's sacrifice is rejected, and Abel's sacrifice is accepted by God. And it's some people thought, well, maybe one didn't offer the right kind of sacrifice, and I think that's possible, but that's not what is stated in the passage where the Lord comes to Cain, and apparently he's angry, and the Lord says, you need to do right, and maybe we're talking about the right kind of sacrifice, or maybe we're talking about the heart behind the sacrifice. You know the story. In Adam and Eve, we had seen them warned of God. Cain is warned by God about this conflict that's going on. In the Adam and Eve story, we saw how they ate the forbidden fruit. In Cain's case, he murders his brother Abel. In Adam and Eve's case, God shows up and he questions them. That happens here too, where God shows up and questions Cain. What have you done? And Cain initially tries to play dumb, but God shows him that he's aware of what's taking place, and he tries to explain it away, and it simply won't be explained away. So Adam and Eve were banished from the garden. They had gone out of the garden, but apparently they were still somewhere in the vicinity of the garden, on the outside instead of on the inside. But now Cain is banished from the area. He will not even be allowed to be in the area near the garden. He goes to a distant land. So we have the Cain and Abel narrative, but Cain, by his actions, shows that he's at enmity with his brother. It sounds like he's playing the part of the serpent, that spiritually speaking, he's the seed of the serpent. Now he's physically he's the son of Adam and Eve, but he's playing the part of the serpent. And then after he is banished, the genealogy picks up, and we go down 7 generations from Cain all the way to one of his descendants named Lamech. And Lamech has a conflict with a young man and kills him, and then writes a song about it. And it's as though we went from bad to worse. And he actually references his great 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 grandfather Cain. So look, if Cain had been protected by God, God actually put a mark on Cain, saying, "No, nobody's supposed to take vengeance on you. That's between me and you." But Lamech boasts and says, "Hey, if God put a protection on Cain, I'm going to put my own protection on Lamech. Don't anyone mess with me," is sort of the idea there. Now, as we come to chapter 5 then of Genesis, we go back from Cain and Lamech. Oh, by the way, chapter 4 ends where Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has Seth, actually it's the same word there, he has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. Now, when it talks about another offspring, the Hebrew word zerah, literally another seed. And so it pulls us back to this promise of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So yes, we have this line of Cain going all the way down to Lamech, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. The conflict is growing. Now we turn to Seth, and we have a separate genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, and we go down. We had 7 generations from Cain to Lamech. We have 7 generations from Seth down to Enoch, and he walks with God. Instead of being involved in this conflict with other people, all we see of him, he's walking with God. and God takes him not as punishment, but as, it sounds like as reward, with the death of each person. And he died, and he died, and then we get to Enoch, and instead of dying, God takes him. Sounds like he takes him alive. Uh, somebody put it this way, they're out for a walk, and God says, "Hey, we're closer to my place than your place. Let's go to my place." And Enoch says, "Okay," and there they go. And he walks with God without dying. But the genealogy continues because he's already had sons and daughters. And so the genealogy is going to go from Enoch down to Noah, and then our story will pick up. But we can't go any further in that direction right now. Instead, I want to look at Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 verse 1 says, "Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them," that is, daughters were just born to people. Verse 2, "that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose." Now, the question around this verse revolves around the identity of this phrase, "these sons of God." Who are these sons of God? And there are two primary theories that have been set forth as to their identity. First of all, the first theory is that these sons of God refer to angels. This is the view taken by Josephus. He's the first century historian, lives a little bit after the time of Jesus, but still in the first century. And he says that this, in fact, he's giving his commentary on the Old Testament, and he comes to Genesis 6, and he just says, he doesn't say it's the theory, he says, and these are angels, fallen angels that went in and took wives of human women. And he goes on to elaborate, and this leads up to the things that are going to bring about the flood. That was the common Jewish interpretation of his day. The sons of God seem to be angels when we get to Job chapters 1 and 2. Remember how the sons of God come to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan shows up too. And it sounds like they might be angels there. And then again, they're mentioned in Job 38, and it's around verse 7 or so. Where it's describing creation, about how at creation all the sons of God shouted for joy. Both of those places seem to be referring to some sort of supernatural life, probably angels. Um, Now, it can be argued, wait a minute, angels of God, angels in heaven don't marry or are given in marriage. Jesus said that. However, the counter argument is that these angels were not in heaven. They were not being obedient. They were not doing what they were called to do. They were doing something different. They were in rebellion against God. So, as they're taking wives, that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing in this interpretation. It is said that the resulting offspring produced giants. Now, that's going to the Septuagint translation for a few verses later. We'll look at that in just a moment. I'm not sure that that's an appropriate translation. I'm not. We'll look at that, but that's part of the argument. And then finally, it seems to be supported. Well, actually, it is supported. There's no seem to be in the book of Enoch. The apocryphal book of Enoch. Now, that's a part of the Apocrypha that the Roman Catholic Church does not accept. This is a part of the book of Enoch is accepted by the Ethiopian Church, and there are actually several versions of the book of Enoch, but they all have this story of angels coming down and taking human women and having children by them. In fact, the book of Enoch actually has this funny little story where the father of Noah is looking at his newborn son Noah. "Oh, aren't you a beautiful? You're almost angelic." And all of a sudden he looks at his wife and says, "Who have you been messing around with?" It's almost comical. However, Jude, and there's only one chapter in Jude, so Jude verse 6 is taken to apply to this interpretation. And again, could be. So that's one possible interpretation. The other possible interpretation is that the sons of God refer to the descendants of Seth. That is, that descendant, that son of Adam and Eve, who replaced Abel and who continues with his own genealogy. The preceding chapter, all of chapter 5, sets forth the contrast of two lines of the descendants of Cain and then the descendants of Seth. So according to this view, this would be just the descendants of Seth that looked that were not particularly discriminating on whom they chose for wives, and maybe there were some believing wives, but there are possibly some unbelieving wives, which is a common theme that we're going to see in later on in the book of Genesis. We read also that men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Again, that might be why they're called sons of God, is because they're calling on the name of the Lord. That's in chapter 4. It is mankind, not angels, that are punished in the flood. So there's no more reference to these sons of God after this passage in the rest of the book of Genesis. And we're going to see the flood being the punishment against mankind, not against any supernatural beings. Sonship is a common theme in the Old Testament. So we're going to see that the sons of, aren't you all sons of God in that sense? And Israel is God's child and God's son in that sense, and is described as such by the prophets. Finally, the marriage of godly seed to ungodly people is a regular and ongoing theme all throughout the book of Genesis. So we don't even have to wait until we get outside of Genesis for that. We're going to see it here. You look at who Ishmael marries, look at who Esau marries, and then look at the call, where Abraham goes so far as to send his servant to find a wife for Isaac, not one of these people, but one of those people, one of those God followers back there in the city of Haran. Well, we continue into verse 3. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Now, there's a prophecy here about man's days are going to be 120 years, but here again, we can take this a few different ways. Are we talking about man's lifespan is going to be down from what it had been? When we look at the average lifespan of people before the flood, Adam and Methuselah, and the average is 900 plus years. So is that what's going to decrease? And let me just say, it does after the flood. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Or is this a prophecy of the flood that's going to come in 120 years? Again, I can take that one either way. We go on to verse 4 and we read, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. I have to chuckle when I see this, because every once in a while, the translators of the New American Standard will come to a Hebrew, or if it's in New Testament, a Greek word, and they'll say, we're not sure how we ought to translate it, so we're just going to put the Hebrew word here in English letters, and you guys figure it out. And that's what they did here. The word Nephilim, Nephal is the word to fall. In fact, we talk about the passive tense, the Nephal tense, or case, actually. But the Nephilim, the fallen ones, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men. Now, it doesn't say those were the Nephilim, it says those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So what's happening here? Well, there were these Nephilim on the earth, these fallen ones. You say, what are the fallen ones? Are those fallen angels? Well, if so, they're not equated as such. It doesn't say that they are the sons of God, just as these other people, whoever they are. Whether they're beings or people, whoever they are. The Nephilim. And we're going to read that term Nephilim when we get to Numbers. There will be another group. I don't think it's the same. There'll be another group also known as the Nephilim, a group of Canaanites living in Canaan. And I take this term to be, we might say, the ruffians, or to modernize it, the biker gang, the guys that are the no-good rogues. They were on the earth in those days. And so I don't think it's necessarily the same group, but a similar group with the same title that we see in the book of Numbers, living in the land of Canaan. And there's some bad people that were in the world in those days. And then also afterward, when the sons of God came into them, by the way, the Septuagint translates the Nephilim as the Giantas, the giants, and that's where Josephus got this idea of giants. I think the Septuagint is wrong. I think it's presenting, and whether you take this as angels or descendants of Seth, I'm not sure we ought to run off into the deep end of the pool with the Nephilim. But notice the last sentence there. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And if you look back at ancient mythology, you see all sorts of stories of these great heroes, people that did wild and crazy things. Think of the story of Gilgamesh, or think of some of the heroes in Greek mythology. And what we're being told here is there were some wild and crazy people, whether you want to take them as angels or descendants of Seth. There are some strange goings-ons back at this time, and they were not good things. They were things in rebellion against God. And then God shows up, and he speaks to Noah. Noah, one of those descendants of Seth, and he tells Noah, Noah, I'm going to bring about a flood that will kill all life in the world. And so God, in chapter 6, verse 14, he gives Noah some instructions. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. Now, notice that word gopher. That's another place where our translator said, we're not sure what gopher word is. That's the Hebrew word, gopher. And so we're just going to put the Hebrew word there with English letters, and you guys figure it out. And so some translations have taken a guess, maybe that's cypress or this wood or that wood. I'm not even going to take a guess. But notice, make for yourself an ark. You say, well, what's an ark? And the term ark, a tiba, is the same word which was used for the ark into which the baby Moses was placed. Now, that was a little tiny ark. That was a baby-sized ark. This is going to be a much bigger ark, a sort of a structure. We could call it I think of the ark into which Moses was placed, a little treasure chest. This is a giant treasure chest, so this is going to be very big. You shall make the ark with rooms, and shall cover it inside and outside with, my translation says, with pitch. Actually, the Hebrew says you shall cover it inside and outside with covering, probably with some sort of pitch, some sort of waterproofing to make sure it doesn't leak. Don't want the thing to go down. We get to verse 15. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Now, a cubit is the length from your fingertip to your elbow. Roughly about 18 inches. I haven't measured my cubit, so I'm not sure if I'm bigger or smaller than that. But that's sort of an adjustable. It depends on the size of the measurer. But I'm going to say roughly, if it's 300 cubits, that'd be 450 feet. That's the size of an ocean-going barge. And I spent a whole career working with fire rescue in a shipping port, so I know all about barges, and they are incredibly seaworthy. What you're looking at here is a model, a picture of a model of what the ark would have looked like with these dimensions, the way it's described here, and that basically looks like a seagoing barge. And I've seen those things go through storms. I've seen them not quite, where one developed a leak and had the serious list, and yet it didn't roll over. They are very, very seaworthy. They can go through hurricanes, and now it might cause them to break apart, but they're going to break apart right side up. They're not going to really roll and overturn. They're low enough to really have a low center of gravity. And notice 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits. So it's really a large undertaking that Noah is being called to do. Now, we have in the story, and notice I've color-coded this because you have in chapter 6, verse 10, Noah's 3 sons are mentioned. And then in chapter 6, verse 18, God says, I'm going to cut a covenant. And we'll talk more about this in a bit, but this is the first use of the word covenant here in chapter 6, verse 18. And there's a promise that he's going to destroy the earth with a flood. Next, there is a command to take food. That's chapter 6, verse 21. And then Noah and his family entered the ark, chapter 7, verse 1. And the whole center part of the story, notice that's almost a chapter and a half. From chapter 11 to chapter 8, verse 13, is the story of the actual flood. I'll come back to that in a second. Then notice we again have Noah and his family. This time they're coming out of the ark in chapter 8, verse 14. Then there's another command, a command not to eat blood. There's another reference to the covenant. This time God makes the covenant. He had promised the covenant in chapter 6, verse 18. In chapter 9, verses 8 through 17, he actually makes the covenant. And this time the promise is not to destroy the earth with a flood again. The first promise was that he would destroy the earth. Now he says, but it won't happen again. And again, there is a reference in chapter 9, verse 18 to Noah's 3 sons. Now, that's the whole flood big narrative. What I want to do is look at that center section, the flood on the earth, chapters 7, verse 11 to chapter 8, verse 13. And we're just going to expand that section. And notice this sort of parallelism. This is known as a chiasm. We haven't really talked about this too much. We saw one in chapter 2. We're seeing this in the entire Noah narrative leading up to, starting with the mention of his three sons and ending with again, the mention of his three sons. But let's look at that central point. We're going to blow that up, and we're going to come to the flood on the earth. Notice that section where the Lord shuts the door and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. That's chapter 7, verses 15 and 16. Next, the waters increase until the mountains are covered. And then the waters prevail upon the earth for 150 days. Some people think they hear 40 days and 40 nights. They think that's the whole length of the flood. No, that's just the beginning phase. Now, for 150 days, the waters prevail. The pivotal point in the whole story is in chapter 8, verse 1. It says, "And God remembered Noah." And that's, it's not that he'd been forgotten, but God's now going to take it and turn it back. And instead of being a flood now, he's going to reduce that. So he remembers Noah. In chapter 8, verse 3, the waters for another 150 days. Now they begin to abate, and they're going down for 150 days. So 150 plus 150 plus 40. Think about that. We're already 340 days. We're almost a year already, and we're not done yet. So for another 150 days, the water abates. We have the waters decreasing until the mountains become visible. Notice the waters that increase until the mountains are covered. Now the mountains become visible. And finally, at the end of 40 days, Noah opens the window, but they're still not done yet. That's just as much as we're counting time. Now he begins the releasing of the birds, and that doesn't really fit into this perfect parallel. So I'm not going to go through that. But he releases birds, and they fly, and there's a raven, and there's a dove, and then there's a dove a second time. This time coming back with an olive branch in its mouth. So that's the central point of the story. And we come after that, like we said, Noah and his family come out of the ark. There's a command. Notice how there'd been a command to take food. There's a command now not to eat blood. And now God enters into the covenant with Noah. And that's the part that we want to look at. But first, let's look at where they landed. Genesis chapter 8 and verse 4, in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. I can't think of how many times people have gone to that location and climbed all over that mountain and looking for the ark. Now, it doesn't say it was on Mount Ararat. It says it was on the mountains, plural, in the land of Ararat, which is quite a different thing. And a lot of people have gone to Mount Ararat and have claimed to have found something that they thought was the ark. It reminds me of the way that back in the Middle Ages, people claimed to have a piece of the true cross. And I think it might have been Martin Luther or Calvin, I forget which one, who made the comment. He said, there are enough pieces of the cross floating around Europe to build an entire house. Well, so many different people have claimed to have found the ark in different locations that if they were all true, there'd be 5 or 6 different arks. I don't think there are. I don't think they have found the ark. But let's look at that location. Here where I think we mentioned in an earlier class the land of Ararat, or as they called it back then, Urartu. It's somewhere in this area where the ark is said to have landed. Like I said, I don't think they found the ark. Remember, 2 of every kind of animal, 7 of the clean ones, but 2 of every kind of all sorts of animals would have included true termites. And I can't help but wonder, all right, they multiplied and expanded, and they've even been in my house. So maybe that's what happened to the ark. Or if I had come off the ark and I was looking to build a new home and resettle, I'd be looking at this big structure for my building material. So it might have gone that way. I simply don't know what happened to the ark. Now we get to chapter 9, verse 8. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth that, with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. And so God is going to establish his covenant. This brings up the question, what's a covenant? A covenant involves a relationship. It involves a series of agreements. It actually contains a curse and blessings. A curse if you break the terms of the covenant, a series of blessings if you keep the covenant. And this covenant, I would suggest, does a lot of those things, if not all of them. And God enters into a covenant. The covenant into which he enters is not just with Noah, although it includes Noah, with his descendants, and with every living creature. Where God says, I'm no longer going to, you step out of line, I'm no longer going to immediately judge you. I'm not going to bring another flood on the earth. I'm not going to judge you. You are. And so he says, look, if there's something bad, a murder that takes place or something like that, and we already addressed that back in the days of Cain and in the days of Lamech, from now on, if it happens, you judge them. And so the idea, whoever takes man's blood by man shall his blood be taken. The idea now is that mankind is going to be given the responsibility of doing a self-judgment upon people. I mean, God's the final judge. He'll judge finally. But in the meantime, this whole idea of government and judgment and things like that, that's part of man's responsibility under the terms of this covenant. So he says in verse 11, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. The rainbow is given as the sign of the covenant. It's a sign that everybody can see. It's a sign that every time it rains, there's a reminder of this promise that God has given. Remember, the bow was a weapon of war, and it was the mightiest weapon of war in that day. With a bow and arrow, you could shoot long distance. You could stand back and shoot somebody, not by being right in their face with a rock or a stick, but you could shoot somebody across a wide area. And God is saying, I'm taking my weapon of war, and I'm going to place it up in the sky, like hanging it over the mantle. It's a way when you see it, it's not pointed at you. In fact, it's pointed at God himself, pointed up, as though if I break my word, then may I be judged. May I be the one that comes under the curse. And God's not going to do that. He's not going to break his curse. And so he has the bow placed in the sky as the sign of the covenant. Next we read, and we're almost finished with this section, but Genesis chapter 9 and verse 20, then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Now there's no judgment given in the passage that says, and Noah sinned. It's just telling it rather matter-of-factly that he drank, he became drunk, uncovered himself inside his tent. What we're going to see here in that uncovering is an interesting parallel with Adam, who had also been placed in a garden. Noah's not placed in a garden, but he begins farming and plants a vineyard. In Adam's case, he became naked. Here, Noah becomes naked. In Adam's case, he already was. He realized that Noah I'm assuming, doesn't really realize what he's doing. That's part of the drunkenness, but he uncovers himself. In Adam's case, he is ashamed, and in the Noah story, the shame is implied, and we're going to see that as we continue the story. Verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan. Now, Ham is one of the sons of Noah, one of three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But he's also the father of Canaan. And as soon as you see Canaan, remember that Canaan is going to enter the story at a later date, where it will be the land of Canaan that will be given ultimately to Abraham's descendants. And you know that's coming, and the readers know that's coming. So here it's mentioned, Ham, the father of Canaan, but it's Ham, notice, that saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. So he verbally reveals his father's shame to his two brothers. 23, notice the reaction of the brothers, but Shem and Japheth, these are the other two brothers, they took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so they did not see their father's nakedness. They seek to cover their father's shame, to cover his nakedness, not to reveal it, not to talk about it. They won't even look with their own eyes. As they cover and do the honorable thing. This is an honor and shame story. And you won't get it if you don't understand honor and shame. So they are treating their father honorably in the same way that Ham has treated his father dishonorably. Verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. He knows about this dishonor. So he said, cursed be Canaan. Now he doesn't curse Ham. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because God had already blessed Shem, Ham, and Japheth as they came out of the ark. And you don't curse somebody that God has blessed. But he does curse Canaan. Now are there other reasons? That would just be speculation, so I'm not going to go there. But cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. We continue. He also said, blessed be the Lord. So Canaan is cursed and the Lord is blessed. Did you catch that? Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Even though he's called the God of Shem, it's not Shem that's blessed, it's the Lord that's blessed. And let Canaan be his servant. Now, it's not entirely clear, is the his, when it's his servant, is his Shem, or is it his, the Lord? Well, I'm not sure that it really matters. I think it will work either way. But let's continue to verse 27, because verse 27 has a pronoun we do have to try to interpret. Verse 27, may God enlarge Japheth. And the word enlarge is Japheth. And then Japheth, of course, is Japheth. So may God Japheth, may he Japheth, sort of a play on his name, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Now, the key question is going to be, who is this pronoun, let him dwell in the tents of Shem? To whom does this pronoun refer? Modern scholars, many of them at least, have sought a way to make that him Japheth. In fact, in the New American Standard, what they'll typically do, they will capitalize a pronoun if it's referring to God. They won't do it if it's referring to just another human being. And that is the approach they seem to be taking here with this passage. And then if you ask them, in what way has Japheth dwelled in the tents of Shem? They'll come up with all sorts of things. There's no uniform answer. There's a bunch of wild guesses, and I believe that's exactly what they are. However, if you go back to the earlier rabbis from antiquity, and you ask them, to whom does the pronoun refer? They will usually tell you, if not always, all the ones I've checked, they'll usually say, well, the subject is the one who is blessed. Who was blessed? It was the Lord who was blessed. Who is let him dwell in the tents of Shem? Who is that? That is God. Now this brings up the question, is there a way that God has dwelt in the tents of Shem? Specifically, is there a way that Moses, as the author of this, and the Israelites in the wilderness as the initial readers of this story, is there a way they would understand that God comes to dwell in the tents of Shem? And the answer is, of course. Very obvious that as they were in the wilderness, as they had been given the tabernacle, God was dwelling in their midst. This is fulfilled in the book of Exodus when they make the tabernacle and God enters the tabernacle and dwells with his people. But that's not all. There's a sense in which there's a continuing dwelling in the tents of Shem. How? John chapter 1 and verse 14. There we read, and the Word became flesh. Speaking of Jesus, he's the one who became flesh. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, when he says dwelt among us, that's not the usual word to just live or hang out with or anything like that. It's actually the term that comes from the related Greek term for a tent. We could actually render this, I don't know of any major translation that does, but we could have rendered this, and the Word became flesh and tented among us. And literally, that's what took place, not just back in the days of the Exodus, but when Jesus became flesh, he was God tenting with us. His own body was the tabernacle. Remember how he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And we saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. He has tented with us, and he still does. What does he say when he ascends into heaven? Lo, I am with you always.